Sure. So my name is Seth Rosen. I'm a 32-year-old game designer living in Brooklyn. Making video games is just about the only thing I've done professionally as an adult. Uh, so it just like in possibly an unhealthy way is very much my identity, and defines a lot of the ways that I spend my time and socialize and all that kind of thing. I have worked on, over the decade or so career that I've had, BioShock Infinite, various Don't Starve things, and most recently Mafia 3. I'm mostly a kind of systems designer. I tend to get really excited about like sort of dynamic emergent systems that are really data heavy, and also systems that are kind of like elegantly authored themselves in ways that the player will never ever experience. It's just kind of like, oh, it's cute that you were able to accomplish this using all of these different things using the same system, because it's a system, and their systems can express a lot of different things if the person that is using them has a deep understanding of its capabilities and kind of idiosyncrasies. So as I mentioned, those are a few of the titles that I've worked on, which kind of runs the gamut from like rather large AAA, 150 people in one studio, and then all the outsourcers and like collaborating studios that are involved, down to 4 to 12 person teams in a sort of like III company in Clay. And more recently, I didn't mention this because nothing came of it, but I've been going the indie route. I left Hangar 13 a little while after Mafia 3 shipped, and started a company with some friends. We made a go of something, and which I'm happy to talk about actually, but didn't get funding, so we kind of walked away from it. And now I'm working on finishing up a project called Nectar Vector that I've been kind of chipping away at nights and weekends for, gosh, I don't know, 6 years now. It was originally prototyped at Clay, and Jamie, my boss there, graciously sold me the rights to it. So that's kind of what I'm doing day to day now, as well as some contracts here and there, and spinning up yet another project because I perennially get myself involved in too much. Sorry, I kind of lost track of.
No, it's fine. There's going to be a lot of that here for both of us. I think that's sort of how these things go. I was already trying to stick a pin in. I have never heard the term III before, but I understand immediately. I think what's meant by that. I'm just surprised I haven't heard it before.
Yeah.
Am I hanging out in the wrong circles, or is this starting to be a new thing people are saying?
No, I think it's a very like industry sort of insider type thing where people who are looking for jobs and getting hired by companies use it as a shorthand for kind of indicating that, hey, this is an independently owned company. You're not kind of under the umbrella of an EA or an Activision or something like that. But it's like an established and healthy company that probably has 30 plus employees at least. And therefore also is able to like execute at a reasonably high level, and like put money on the screen in terms of how much art is there and that kind of thing.
Gotcha. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I guess in that sense, like it could be used from a more player perspective, but I don't tend to hear it in that way.
Yeah, I haven't heard it before, but I can sort of parallel park what that term means into what it is, but maybe it's sort of an odd place to start the conversation. I don't know, because it's like it is weird how much this is like not quite a talking point, but it is a point of discussion and a thing to consider. I don't know. Are we? I don't know who we is, but like, are we overly concerned with like how much money goes into like making a game? Like, does it have any sort of bearing, you think, on like the ultimate enjoyment or experience that like someone will have, on a game you've worked on, or like do you think it's like a helpful classification? Because it's obviously not going anywhere because it keeps getting more and more wrinkles, this sort of thinking. And we can close the subject if it's not interesting to you, but it's it's weird. I haven't thought about it, and it's getting me thinking about it. Yeah.
I think this is interesting. I mean, like, on the one hand, I think there's some usefulness there in terms of kind of understanding what's, like, if you look at a big AAA game, which, feels a little silly to be deploying those terms in the actual conversation of such, but
sure.
If you think about a game of that sort of pedigree and investment level from the company that's helping is funding it and making it happen, like, there's some things that you can kind of immediately know about it. One is that it's going to be super polished, and again, there's going to be a lot of money on screen, and like, I mean, I think of like Naughty Dog and the way that, like, they just have like this incredibly rich animation on everything that is in all of their games. In a way that a smaller company could just not justify the cost of.
Right.
Both in terms of like spending the money on it, because basically anything that goes into a video game, like, the thing itself doesn't cost money, it costs man hours, and that costs money. So, like, this is all building up to say, like, those kinds of games, you can expect a certain polish level and sort of, like, I guess, high polyness to them.
Well, I think that's right, though. It's like maybe it is more about setting expectations rather than it being like the list of ingredients. Like, it's not it's telling you something, but it's not telling you everything, and it's certainly not telling you how to feel about the thing you're going to be experiencing. But it is. I guess it's just like the weird thing to me is like, well, but it's like often dictated by like money. You know what I mean? Like, it's the byproduct of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of wonder if it maybe pushes a little bit into like expectations of what the play experience is going to be. Like, obviously, all that aesthetic stuff, sure, that feels fairly obvious.
Right.
But like with the investment level and money behind it going up, so increases kind of the company's exposure on it, like what their risk is, which then probably tends to decrease the kind of level of interestingness and how surprising a thing will be.
Right. Well, I mean, those are subjective too, but
sure.
I guess it depends how abstract do we want to get out of the gate. Because I mean, I think what I was originally sort of expecting to ask was like a little bit more like biographical stuff about like
right. Sure. Yeah.
We'll weave our way. We'll reverse parallel park back here later, I think, once we've laid some more ground. But like, yeah, I mean, because I was really curious, just from our emails and stuff. Because I mean, you sort of laid out like, the lineage of like how you grew up with games and you grew up playing games, and you mentioned like the tenacity in your wrestling career, I think was the phrase you used, that helped you get started working in video games. And so, now you've done a variety of stuff and you've worked on games that, people have heard of. And so I guess I wonder, like when you started out, like what were you imagining would be your path? And, is it the path that like you find yourself down now? Because I know you said that like it was kind of brutal. That's my word, not yours, about like just what the applying process was like and where you were trying to get a foothold.
Yeah, I mean, the word I guess I would choose when thinking about that is grueling more than brutal.
What's the difference?
Well, like it was a grind. I mean, so for context, when I graduated from university, I applied to, I estimate, about 150 positions of basically anything under the sun that I thought I was remotely qualified for at a video game studio.
Yeah.
And like I never really felt discouraged. I know, there was disappointment when I would get like get a phone interview and then it wouldn't go anywhere past that. But it always just kind of felt like an inevitability, and I think this is why I mentioned my wrestling career. Like in 8th grade, which was my second year of wrestling, our coach had us write a 500-word essay about the meaning of tenacity, and that kind of set the stage for me just to kind of come at that sport with that lens to say okay, I'm not very good at this right now, but I care a lot about it and I'm really motivated, so I'm just going to kind of keep doing it, perhaps obsessively, until I achieve the result that I want. And in the case of working in video games, it was the same kind of thing of just okay, I've just decided to do this, so this is what the process is. And it wasn't an actively unpleasant experience, but it was tedious, I guess.
Yeah. Well, you said you got it was QA, right? That was where you first landed?
Yeah, that was my first, well, it's sort of complicated. That was my first paid job in the industry. I ended up taking an unpaid QA internship at a Russian company that had a 10-person office in the Boston area, so they could pretend to be an American company. So I was supposed to do, yeah, I mean.
That is complicated, yeah.
So I was.
Why were they doing that? Not to get too far afield. Why were they doing that? Why are they doing that?
And I think it was just a business opportunity thing. The way that I phrased that is probably reductive.
Sure.
I think, yeah, just sort of people are workers are cheaper in Russia, and all of the contacts and sort of business-facing side of the business at that point in time really existed more so in North America.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't think it was
yeah, I mean, you learn this as we go on, and my most immediate upcoming questions. I mean, I don't know. I'm really interested in the minutia, or maybe it's the banal stuff of why game companies seem to sort of work the way they do, because I've been doing these interviews for many years now, and part of it came out of wanting to learn about stuff like that, but I feel the more I learn I don't know, and the more I feel I don't know really anything about the way game companies work. And so I mean, I guess what was that like for you, when you got your first, I'm doing finger quotes, proper job? I don't know why. It wouldn't even need finger quotes. Once you got your first proper job, in games, what do you remember sort of being surprised to learn about the way either that company the way that company works, or just the way that pipelines and workflow seems to work in general about games? What were you sort of not prepared for, didn't have an awareness of once you made the leap from I don't want to say non-professional to professional, but I guess that is sort of the I guess from beginner to professional. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I eventually, some months later, landed a paid a quote-unquote real job as a QA tester at Irrational, which was kind of this wild place to start my career, because this is a studio I joined in 2013. No, sorry, that's when I left. I joined in 2011, and at that point, the first BioShock Infinite E3 trailer had been shown, which was the first real glimpse of the next game from the studio made by that made BioShock. So I was walking into this building that felt like sort of hallowed ground. It was this kind of heavyweight studio, and I was lucky enough to already live in Boston and therefore be basically eligible for a position like QA where they're not going to relocate someone. So, I was a little bit intimidated. I was also ecstatic to just be a part of it. My career since then has showed me in a bunch of ways like how special that team was. And so on the one hand, I was surprised to discover how rote a lot of QA work can be, especially during like early stages of development when there isn't actually that much game built yet, and what you're more doing is kind of ensuring stability of the tools and little bits that have been played. We would do these what's called a smoke test, which is basically like, okay, there's a new build today because programmers did work on the engine yesterday, so run through the same 50 tests of loading this map and then loading this map and loading this map and checking, can you reload this gun? Can you reload this gun? It's really detail oriented in a way that can be a little bit mind numbing, but also can be like really exciting when something goes wrong and like you're the firefighters at that point.
Right. You catch things before that might otherwise not have been caught.
Right. And it feels honestly a little bit like being in the weeds. I don't know if you've ever like waited tables or worked in retail or anything like that. But when you're just like buried and you're juggling 4 different things, like there's a real like adrenaline that comes from that, I find.
So is it like that at every level or up to a point? I know that it's difficult to talk about because I know like game companies. I don't want to say that there's no standardization, but my understanding is like the same role or title may have a different function at different teams, and the hierarchy might be different. And,
right.
But I wonder. I mean, is that firefighting feeling you mentioned, is that sort of present at every level in your experience, or does it only seem to exist up to a point? See, I don't want to say hierarchy because I know some game companies say that they're flat. So
right.
That's me just sort of walking a question and trying to walk away from the question.
No. I think there's a real question there that's like worth investigating. In my experience, the firefighting goes away. Like I think QA and production tend like their main roles are firefighters. And now our metaphor is going to get real muddy because I'm going to say that the people who are doing more like implementation style work tend to be like more musicians and they're jamming. Like you get that same kind of like flow state, like, oh man, I'm like just either dynamically responding to something. I mean, in both cases you're dynamically responding to something. It's just whether something that needs fixing or something that is like sort of generative, if that makes sense.
I think so. But so, yeah, I forget at this point because I think I asked you like, well, where were you kind of hoping? I don't want to say where you're hoping to wind up, but like, so you're doing or you had done systems design, and so like that's the thing where it's like, all right, well, I think I know what that means. Like, was that a thing when you started? In QA, were you trying to work your way to systems design, or is this just a thing? Is it a thing that sort of just wound up happening in the way that careers usually just sort of happen to you?
There's a little bit of both. Like I've always been someone really that's really organized and that likes kind of planning and organizing. So I was kind of looking at the production track. I studied computer science in school, so I was looking at being a programmer. And, like anyone starting out in video games, probably fancied myself a little bit of a designer. And I'd always been much more interested in systems design as opposed to level design because of, I think, the way that my brain does better with, like, logic and patterns and that sort of thing than like, spatial sort of 3D thinking. I think I have a reasonably good eye for like responding to other people's visual work, but I have very little confidence in my own ability to create it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I remember it must have been around the time that like I guess it was the leap to games, console games starting to be on CD, and I remember like the leap from like Nintendo 64 to well, I was gonna say to PlayStation, because I was thinking about like the story I remember hearing about like the production of Metal Gear Solid, and how, if that even is the name of the game, the first PlayStation Metal Gear. Yeah. And I remember the language sort of shifted to bigger games, where they described it as like it almost being symphonic, where there's all these different disciplines working in tandem, reading the same sheet music but having wildly different points of entry, wildly different dynamics, and I could torture some more metaphors here.
No,
but
that's sort of
my understanding. Yeah, but I mean that's like 20 years ago at this point, so I'm sure it's like symphonies upon symphonies at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way that I would think about it is that the symphonies are being played with some different instruments now, and some of them are harder and some of them are easier. But kind of fundamentally, it's still about playing a symphony.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. I mean, the goal is still still the same.
Like you still need to get this massive group of people to come together and build a thing with their distinct abilities all contributing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just like part of my ignorant assumption of like, because I don't make games, but I've heard things like, oh well, every time there's a new generation, and I guess it's on my mind because there's over the horizon at some point soon there will be another generation of consoles coming out, but like there's been that thing I've heard of like, well, every console generation there's like a production cost rise by like a factor of 10, and so I think I always assumed that like, because I don't know how games are made, that there must also be a similarly exponential leap in the complexity.
I think it really depends what your discipline is. Like, I mean, I was kind of mostly expecting to end up being a programmer because that's what I'd studied. But it turns out I'm not very good at programming, so here we are.
I'm much worse at it than you, I can guarantee you.
It's a low bar, but I appreciate it.
I'm just trying to make you feel better.
Low bar, to be clear.
I understood what you meant.
But, like, thinking back to, like, making a game on the original Nintendo, like, I don't have any desire to do that. That sounds horrible.
Yeah.
And the tools have changed enough and have, like, been made more accessible enough that, like, a relative idiot like me can kind of just rock up and like, okay, I'll figure this out. Like, I'm smart enough to kind of like pick something up, but if you're going to ask me to like be juggling memory addresses and like figuring out like clever ways to tile things and things like that, like, no, that's not a problem that my brain is interested in.
Well, so let me ask you this then, because like if I'm understanding you correctly, it's like, well, so it's like this like dual overlapping parallel thing of like, it gets the tools to make them as time goes on, like they become more known quantities and they're best practices and there's like understood ways to troubleshoot them, and yet like it opens up the door to more complexity. In other words, like you may have to wear fewer hats now compared to like the NES era or whatever. So like I guess like it sort of frees you up. Like there's still obviously technical things, but there's much more. Like I think the thing I'm trying to figure out is like, as a systems designer, like could you talk about like a certain system, like that you remember, like what is the work that goes into like the decision making, the implementation of like any system in a game, or is that too broad to ask?
It's like
not. If the technology is freeing you up, then like where are the moving parts now in like trying to make a decision about like the way a thing should be and how it should feel and all that.
So I think there's kind of like a few levels that you have to make decisions as a systems designer, and like in my career I've also kind of existed as a hybrid programmer for all that I've said about not being very good at it.
Sure.
But that's mostly in the context of like a 4-person team, so it's just kind of out of necessity.
Sure.
But like so the first thing that you need to decide, is like what even is the thing that you want to make? Like you need to figure out what am I trying to achieve here, and then the next decision is how am I going to architect a system that will allow me to build it, and also, and then I guess like the kind of follow-on question from that is, do I do it in the stupid way to prove this idea, or do I do it in a more flexible kind of long-term way that will allow us to iterate and kind of like find the good version of it? Because almost certainly the first thing you build is not going to be that version.
Sure.
So usually you'll just like throw some prototype together, and then based on the relative success of that, be like, okay, here's kind of a slightly more refined picture we have now of the thing that we want to build. What does it make sense? Like, how should we actually structure the underlying thing in terms of like literally writing the code and sort of what hooks and handles we're providing to our team of people that are going to actually like use this system in order to author the experience that the player actually has. And I think I'm a reasonably good game designer, but I think that level of like system architecture design is actually the thing that I'm personally best at, because I kind of have that crossover programming ability. So I have a pretty deep understanding of like, okay, like, yes, I can hold in my head what we're finally driving at, but I also kind of understand what the component pieces are and kind of what the atomic pieces are, and how we can then develop a system that allows us to create that and maybe also like 4 different things that are pretty close to that.
Well, I wonder, I don't know if you're allowed to talk about stuff like this or if you want to, but like, for example, I guess you mentioned that you worked on Mafia 3, right?
Yeah.
So like one system that like leaps to mind is like, I don't know if there's a non-clunky way to describe what it is, but it's like the racism system in the game. What was the actual less clunky way? Like, what is the name of that system that's not that? Because I assume it's not called. The way that we talked about that, sure. So we're not just calling it, Please, yeah. And I would rather, because I think you're a primary source on this, I would rather defer to the language you would use for it.
Yeah. So on the team, we talked about kind of that whole aspect of the game as the living world, and that encompasses a bunch of things that are not necessarily directly about how you, the player character, a half-black Vietnam War vet, is treated in 1968 New Orleans. But all of the systems that are kind of in place to make the world feel alive, because we knew that was going to be an important part of what that experience was going to be, had to have levers available to drive racist behaviors in the game.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like it's funny because like I don't know, I keep bringing up Metal Gear, but like I think of it as like it's like a progression in a way of like a stealth system almost.
Oh, so are you specifically talking about like the way that racist characters on the streets will kind of notice you and like give you special attention?
Yeah.
So I mean that even expands into systems that are adjacent to the living world, which is AI perception and all of that kind of thing. But it intersects really directly with all the living world stuff. Like when we spawn a character, an NPC in Mafia 3, it's basically a procedural process that says like, okay, we're going to go down this decision tree where we say, okay, is this a man or a woman? Are they white or black? Are they racist or not racist? Are they rich, middle class, or poor? And it gets like through this decision tree, you kind of figure out what the person is going to kind of demographically be, and then we, based on that, pick like a character voice for them, which then determines which lines they can select from when they go to try and play a piece of dialogue of a given like archetype, which is kind of how the system works under the hood. Like if a person sees you on the street, they just say like voice greeting, and what that specific content might be will depend based on all of those tags that are applied to the character in that decision tree that I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. So when someone notices you, the kind of perception and detection system that kind of drives the core AI like moment-to-moment behavior has no idea about race or anything really. It's just like there's a game actor of type player right here, and I'm game actor of type like non-player character. So if all of the conditions are right, then I should try and do X. And then what X is kind of abstracted from that sort of sensory system. And then it's kind of driven by like what neighborhood you were in and what all the demographic facts about this character that we picked are. Because you know, like if you're in the rich white neighborhood in that game, you get treated differently. So it's not just about the character even. Like it's which is why we talk about it as a living world, because it's taking into account all sorts of different things about where and when and how you are in the game.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I guess it's a couple years ago now, and I don't know how much attention was paid to that particular system, or if I'm misunderstanding system and it's part of a bigger system. Please let me know. But I mean, it just sort of leaped to mind from the things I know you've worked on. And bearing in mind, like you said, like, well, you know, like the first version, you know, that we try is not going to be the final version that winds up in it. So I guess I'm sort of curious if you are allowed to talk about it. Like, well, what were sort of the discussions that went into implementing that, and like where were you and the teams involved, like mindful of like ways to make sure it was done, you know, sensitively, and to make sure that like, you know, it's being read the way it's intended to be read. But again, it being a couple of years ago, I don't know how much attention was paid to that. It immediately leaped to mind just as we were talking here. But my sense of time lately is kind of off anyway.
Sure. I mean, it was something that we talked about a ton, and like paid a lot of careful attention to. I mean, at one point in development, like, I mean, there's literally a cooldown that controls how frequently a character can say the N-word at you. Initially we didn't have that, which just meant you were getting like inundated with this stuff, which, as you might imagine, is not a comfortable experience for a lot of people. So we added this cooldown to kind of modulate that, because, you know, it was really important to us that we were going to kind of model and demonstrate this aspect of American life both then and now, even though it is historically sort of situated in the game. Like, it's absolutely still the kind of shit that happens today.
Right.
So it was really important to us that, like, if we were going to go down the road of having this half-black main character, that it's not like that's a political choice, and we need to kind of make good on that. So we knew that we needed to keep it, but, you know, there's this process of kind of figuring out a way to keep it in there and make sure that it's part of that experience, but not make it a like overwhelming aspect of the experience, I guess. Because fundamentally, it's still like a AAA open world game that 2K Games wants to sell a lot of copies.
Right. No, I haven't forgotten that.
Right.
But I mean, I wonder, because like I mean, that I think is part of like why I'm always thinking about like, wow, I have no idea, how much work goes into making these games, and I just assume it's a lot, and it's probably more than I can ever imagine. But like, even even this one system that we're talking about, like, I mean, maybe even since Mafia 3, because I know you're doing different types of work now. I mean, do you feel like is it generally lost, or is it unfair to generalize about like whether like do players, critics, whoever, like, do they tend to forget that like how much thought goes into things in general, but also things like this in games?
Sorry, was there more to that?
No, if you want to interrupt, I'm here to listen to you. I was going to ask an unrelated. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in that I don't think that that's like a unique thing to games. I think it's really easy for us as a culture and as a society to like just and as creators too. Like I think it's really easy to ignore the fact that every single decision you make is a decision, and even if it doesn't feel like a decision that you sit there and like think about and say this is what we will do, it's still a decision, and that carries weight and meaning. And I think because of in the case of Mafia 3, what we were tackling, like there is just this understanding on the team that like the stakes are pretty high here. We can't fuck this one up.
Well, I guess it sort of comes back to mine too, because and we don't really need to discuss, specific companies or titles or individuals, but I think the surprising and disappointing thing is how often, especially material like that, like how much of a stumbling point it continues to be. And so it's like it would be a dumb question, I think, to be like, well, why are racist games or elements of games that are rated like? Well, it's like, well, obviously because like racism is like still a part of our society, and video games don't exist in a vacuum. Right. That was sort of like where the rest of that question was going to be. But I mean, maybe it's like, I think that's the thing is like I keep scratching my head because it's like, well, but stuff that's much more inelegantly handled or more thoughtlessly handled or maybe intentionally handled with hate, it's like, well, why does this continue to be such a stumbling, thing? Because it seems like it's kind of a known pattern. Like, I guess this might also expand to your systems design thinking, because it's a different sort of system expanding out. But I don't know, and I don't know if it's fair or unfair to single out video games in this regard, but it's like, gosh, didn't we just go through a thing like this last year? And it's like it still continues to be a thing. Not really a question in there, but I just wonder why it keeps happening over and over and over again.
So, I mean, that sort of like leans towards something that I've been thinking a lot about in these last few months in the wake of George Floyd and all the protests that have been happening. I saw a photo of like graffitied quote back in June. It was a quote from, I just pulled it up because I never remembered exactly. It's a quote from Eliezer Yudkowsky that goes, "You are personally responsible for becoming more ethical in the society you grew up in." Which I think like that really resonated with me, and I've been going through this process of like kind of just forcing myself to be educated and like look at this stuff directly in its face in a way that as a privileged white guy was really easy to not do for most of my life. So I think there's a certain amount of just like kind of coming around and like saying, okay, I'm willing. I just have decided to acknowledge that everything that I do has meaning, like, and in a lot of cases, because it's just like deciding what I'm going to have for lunch today. No one cares about that, and very few people see it. But everything you do has meaning. I mean, to maybe give a little bit of weight to that lunch example of like do I eat meat or not in this lunch?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and there's other things too. I mean, I think that's true, and I guess, to be clear, I'm saying well, I mean, we don't have to discuss, because I think it's an uncomfortable thing. I'm not asking you to call anyone on the carpet individually, but in a way, I think maybe thinking of, because a thing that always sort of bugs me is how often the industry, quote unquote, is discussed, and I always wonder well, who are we referring to, and is it a regional industry? Is it a hemispherical industry? Is it a worldwide industry? I feel in some ways the wrong question is well, why does this keep happening? Because it's I think it's well, what is it? Yeah, I mean, maybe it's unfair to separate games out from the rest of the world, but it is a thing where it's well, what is it with power, clout, and whatever else that attracts, or that people in video game companies that they aren't doing that introspection that you're saying, right? Because you can't really go in front of the building of some game company and be asking, hey, why don't you realize everything you decide has meaning? You have to go inside the building and talk to people. I don't know that there's a question in there, but I'm thinking it through, because I feel this is a persistent theme, not just in these conversations, but it's been around, in video games alone, probably since before the beginning, So it would be naive to expect it to go away overnight. But I realize too, this is far afield from what we discussed talking about. So.
No, not at all. We'll follow it wherever it goes.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
I guess with games, I'm sort of torn between, let's be serious. This is a whole culture, whole society problem. This is not unique to games. But at the same time, games do kind of feel they're uniquely bad at it, or rather game makers, or game companies, maybe more accurately.
I feel that too.
Especially this year, these past few months, it's been very sort of popular for brands to kind of get on this social change bandwagon, and you saw a bunch of Black Lives Matter statements from game companies, but you still, I expect the next time that E3 happens, there will be some edgy sci-fi game that depicts some dystopian future, and the person on stage will be saying it's not political. We just think it's interesting and fun. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But I mean,
it's almost I wonder if there's a math, there's a calculus or a math that can be run. It's well, is the heat we can take over saying this better than stepping in it in a different way? Because it's there's sort of a playbook in a way, right? For how to sort of duck that sort of pressure. And I've had conversations with other. Wait a minute. You teach at NYU, right?
I do.
Okay, so I was going to say, Frank Lance, and I was oh yeah. You definitely know who Frank Lance is.
I sure do, and I work with his son as well.
Well, because you didn't mention it when you introduced yourself, and I know with COVID and everything, I wasn't sure if you were still doing that, or because I talked to Frank just before COVID hit, and last phone conversation we had, he was yeah, I think they're gonna cancel GDC maybe. So
God,
so that was
blast from another world.
So that was 50 years ago this year. But when I talked to him for an interview, there was another version of this with the whole OG's Lives Matter, which actually I guess is the same year as Mafia 3 came out. So we're just going to keep reliving 2016 here. Well, but I was talking to Frank about it, and I think I was asking a version of the same question, and he was well, it's kind of good in a way, because these stumblings mean that there's a push towards progress, and there's an effort being made. But here it is, it's 4 years later, and it's the same question, and we have a example from fewer than 2-3 weeks ago.
Right.
Maybe it was last week even. And I think about that often, like the whole well, this is what progress looks like. And I agree, progress doesn't look like what we think it should. But it also, I mean, is it just a case of you need to keep putting your hand on the stove to learn it's hot, or can't we just turn the stove off more
I
proactively? Can we stop burning ourselves?
That would be nice. It doesn't feel good.
It might feel good to stop. Yeah, it might.
Right. It might be
we
nice
could try it. We could just try it for a change, right?
I guess where my head goes with that, as I'm sitting with this and sort of trying to sort out what's different about games versus movies, because movies have racist imagery in them as well, and sometimes problematic imagery in similar ways. I think with games, the thing that to me feels unique is the degree to which we blow it so reliably, and then in a almost Trumpian way, just deny everything. It's no, this isn't political. I'm not racist.
Right. I mean, I feel in a way this connects in a different way with something else you had said about you said something else that's been on your mind lately is why game developers at various levels end up making the same thing over and over again in different ways. And I think how it connects here is well, is that a part of learning? You do have to keep making the same mistake over and over again. I mean, I don't know if Albert Einstein actually said it, but I mean, I think what they say about attempting the same thing again and again, and yet it seems to be what we're doing. So,
and I guess on the one hand, the market supports it. People are buying Assassin's Creed year in, year out.
I think as we speak, they're announcing new ones. So
right.
something.
Moment,
Yeah.
Alongside surely absent acknowledgement of the way that Ubisoft has messed up recently.
Well, I mean, that was the thing. I mean, I noticed just before we hopped on that they had a statement about it, a film statement, but it preceded the actual presentation.
It's divorced.
And then I think somebody called them out on it, and they were like, "Oh, well, there was a time constraint," which was part of why I was saying well, I think there's a playbook here on they know how to duck certain types of heat,
right?
And just because I think we're all aware we do live in this world where it's going to be somebody else's turn, if not next week, by the end of tomorrow.
Right.
So I feel like I'm getting lost in my own thoughts here, but I mean, I guess we could bridge to well, why is it they keep? Maybe it is actually the same thing, about why game developers, as you were saying, at various levels, end up making the same thing over and over again. I mean, it would, yeah.
I guess the connection to me here is that people's feathers get ruffled every time this happens. But the companies responsible don't seem to have any sort of material punishment that comes down on them. So there's almost not even a lesson there. There's a moment of embarrassment, but like you said, they've kind of figured out how to duck these things enough to get to the next news cycle, and then people buy enough of their games anyway that they're as an organization, and maybe also on an individual level, that's harder to have vision into, just don't really have to have that about face moment where they're oh, this was a series of choices we made, and they're it's still selling, so we don't really need to make a different choice next time.
So, well, I think maybe one extra facet on it is, I mean, I sort of clunkily brought in that, you're doing some teaching at NYU, and so I wonder, how does all of this look to, the newer generation it sounds condescending to say of kids, but how does it look to the newer generation of students, coming up studying games? Like, are they aware of the repetition of these patterns? Do you feel like they have wildly different, or even different at all, like goals than you had before you sent out 150 applications? Like, I've talked to NYU students in the past, but it hasn't been that long. My sense of time is all screwed up.
It was yesterday.
It was like 3-4 weeks ago. It was an NYU student who went back home out to California, so they weren't in New York when I talked to them. So I temporarily blanked. But I mean, that's not the same as teaching a class of them and being exposed to the group dynamics and off the cuff comments they make. Like, do they seem to be aware of these patterns? Do they have different goals than you did when you were coming up and thinking about games?
I think, yeah, definitely. I mean, I taught Intro to Game Development, which is one of the gateway courses for the major at NYU. So I didn't get I was very much teaching these students literally how to make a game, not seeing what they really wanted to make necessarily. Because about half the assignments are just clone this thing, literally make this exact thing. But that said, I think they're just growing up in a culture where they're exposed to a more diverse set of games. The world of games is bigger and more diverse than it was when I was growing up, when I was in college. And, also culturally, part of my first day regimen is okay, everyone go around and tell me your name and your preferred pronoun. Which is not a thing that happened when I was in school. And I went to Wesleyan, which is one of the oft ridiculed kind of lefty hippie liberal arts schools. And I was class of 2010, and during our orientation, they taught us about Z was the non-binary pronoun that was kind of in vogue at that point. So there was some of that, but it was not just kind of an assumed hey, this is part of getting to know each other. So I think the younger generation is generally more sensitive to this stuff. I do think to a large degree it's generational. The people in these creative director positions and in control of these larger companies are of an older generation where they weren't raised in that culture where it is sort of expected to be more mindful of these sorts of issues. Yeah. I mean, I think that's right, and I think I think the tempting thing when we say these things are generational is people can think the passage of time alone will sort of address it, but it's actually it's passage of time that's filled with agency, being outspoken, and sort of vigilantly calling it out. I mean, it makes sense that multinational corporations are not going to turn on a dime. Although it would be nice. It would. If only we could turn the stove off immediately instead of taking it down number by number.
I got to get permission first before I got to touch the stove. But I think there's sort of a broader theme here of how kind of dehumanizing, if that's the word, because you had mentioned the thing about how, and I think that's sort of a common criticism of I mean, I think there's a couple things. It's been pretty interesting to watch as many video game series have gone on, how no matter how differently they may have started however many years ago, how there's sort of this how many of them have very many of the similar elements, and in fact even seem to be similar types of games. And so I mean, when it comes to making the same thing over and over again, it sort of suggests well, there's a lack of creativity happening there. And I was actually emailing with a friend of mine over, last weekend. And, I'm just going to actually read to you from a thing I said to him, which I was like, I was typing and I was like, I should ask Seth about this because this relates to the thing he said. I was saying that, like, actually, I think there's a very weird interpretation of what creativity is, because it must take endless creativity to sort of deviate from the norm, but still very obviously be sticking to it. And so that's the end of the quote there. But it's like, so other than capitalism, like, what are the reasons you think we're sort of stuck in these patterns? Or, I mean, I would just be interested to hear it discussed, if you can, like, how actually, like, it does take a lot of creativity to sort of, like, revisit a particular well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, so what I was talking about with, like, being sort of frustrated about the way that the game industry kind of keeps making the same thing over and over again is very much a selfish thing, both because, like, as a designer, I always want to be working on a new problem. Like, it's really boring to me to just make the same thing again. It's like a lot of why I've left companies in the past in my career is because I'm just kind of staring down the barrel of making what I just made again. I'm like, yeah, I could do a better job this time, but I'd rather solve a new problem. And as a player, like, I'd rather be presented with a novel experience than, which is funny because that's, like, not necessarily how I consume other media. Like, I don't know. I have to think about about that.
Yeah. I think no, because I was with you. I was thinking about it, and then I just lost it. I lost it as well.
I can at least, like, actually answer your question instead of talking about a parallel thing that is interesting to me.
Either way, honestly, I consider a response a response. They're all these are icebreakers. These are not questions.
Sure. But I do think the actual question is interesting because it's like when you were asking it, I could feel myself kind of rankling, like, I don't know, like, is it that creative to just take a thing and like make it again but different? And the real answer is yes. Like, it doesn't feel sexy, but, like, even the things that I'm interested in making and have, like, gotten excited about as my own ideas, like, they're not brand new modes of game. Like, they're not going to invent a new genre. I'm taking elements from other like existing works and saying, okay, that's interesting. Here's how I think it could fit into this other thing, or here's, like, an aspect of it that I like that I could redeploy in this other context. Like, I think it's sort of this dual process of seeing the trees for the forest, if you know what I mean by that, in terms of, like, picking out the detail that is actually interesting, and also simultaneously being able to understand how that might be appropriate in a different context, or, like, understanding the ways in which it falls short and coming up with some novel solution to that. It, like, as I'm thinking about a bunch of the game ideas that I have kicking around, like, every single one of them is kind of like it's X but with a twist. Like, that's just it's like a really easy. It's not easy, but it's a more obvious thing to be like, okay, this is a formula that I can look at and refer back to when I'm stuck, and it is a framework for me to kind of, like, hang all of my weird shit on that I'm interested in exploring, and through that kind of mitigate risk, both creatively and in terms of, like, getting players to understand what it is that I'm making.
It's tough because I think all I was going to say all creative things, but I think it's just all things, period. I mean, that's just kind of the way our brains function. We need buckets, and we want to put stuff in buckets. And if we can't put stuff in buckets, then it's gonna wash away, or it'll be buried in buckets. Because it's like, as much as we sort of cringe, like, yeah, an elevator pitch is a nice thing to have, and as much as we cringe, it's X but Y.
Right. Or like X crossed with Y, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's helpful, but it's reductive, and yet, yeah, I mean, it feeds into whole host of many other things. Of like, well, it's expensive to take these sorts of risks, and also these sorts of like quote unquote risky things, like don't get signal boosted that often, and it's like dependent on like an individual's goals, and there's all these other things, and it's like, I mean, I actually am circling back now to like what you were just saying. It's like, well, I don't know. Is the amount of risk that I'm hoping for personally with video games, is it parallel to other mediums? Like, am I looking for? I mean, I feel like I am, but I feel like I had to be exposed to a lot of stuff for a long time, go through being burnt out on, going really deep on some things. And now I think like what is most refreshing to me is just like, well, maybe so. Yeah. I mean, I just feel like, well, yeah, I think I do expect that from other stuff. Like, I want to see stuff I haven't seen before, but I'm a weird dude, and like,
if so, then I am too, because I place a huge premium on novelty.
Yeah. I think there's a thing. Anyone who's driven to create or to sort of break down creations, there's I feel like I never feel anything more exciting in a video game than when like I don't understand like what is happening, or like what is happening with like the systems that are guiding it. Where but I mean, like you and I, we come from like the same generation, I think, of game players, where like I'm really interested in like playing probably the way creators are not intending, or I'm really interested in like poking at the seams.
Kind of
it's all
the system.
Yeah, but I mean that's just like growing up with Nintendo and stuff.
Right.
It's like well, where are the secrets? And so like it is pretty rare, and I don't even know if it's fair anymore to like expect really, really big companies to take those sorts of risks. And then I go back and it's like, well, but they have a lot of money. But it's like, yeah, but then they have a lot of money to lose, and then that's a lot of people's jobs that are on the line. And so, I mean, I feel like this thing that you're sort of, I guess, part of a tradition of, like, it's kind of really commonplace now. Like, people sort of, leaving the AAA space. now there's even, it's formalized now where we can say like, oh yeah, you can leave AAA and go III.
Right.
I don't know that I have a significant conclusion on that, but I think it may actually be maybe a sign to have some hope, or maybe not. I don't know.
I mean,
I don't know how optimistic you're feeling about yeah. Because I often just think it's unfair to be like, all right, well, hey, you people with the least money, you should take the biggest risks. It's just like, well, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right.
So I was listening to a couple of your other interviews to kind of get my bearings on these, and that same kind of topic came up, and I thought of this analogy that I really like, which is that, like, if you're sailing through this like patch of sea where there's tons of like huge chunks of ice and icebergs, would you rather have like the small maneuverable craft or a huge cruise ship? Like you can just be more agile and like sort of find the tricky solutions in a way faster and therefore more reasonable to pursue way when you're a smaller team, just because the loop of communication is so much tighter, and you also kind of know, hopefully, that everyone's kind of bought in on what like the game experience that you're building is, instead of getting a task handed down of like, model this thing or animate that or implement, like, place things all over this level. Like big video games are very much sort of assembly line efforts in a way.
Yeah. That's I mean, I told you I don't know much about, and I've been trying to learn more, but that is the single loudest thing I have been hearing and feel like I've learned is that it is almost like an assembly line.
Yeah, I mean, on Mafia 3, like, you know, there's all these different animations that our non-player characters can play around the city to kind of, like, make them active and breathe some life into our living world. And there's, like, something like, I think, 750 different actions that they can do in the game. And we had to have that list locked, like, probably 9 months before it shipped so that all of it could get mocapped, and then all the mocap data could be cleaned up and then imported into the game, and then the, like, AI smart objects, the system that actually, like, makes them do things, be built, and then that gets checked by QA, and then we file bugs and change the height of the seat because it's not symmetric. You know, it's like there's very little sort of in the trenches sort of big C creative choice happening on a game like that. Like it's much more up to the directors, which, you know, they're steering this huge boat with 150 people working on it. You're just not able to turn as tightly.
Right. Yeah. Well,
but at the same time, I would love if those companies with like buckets and buckets of money would like fund smaller teams that can be a little bit riskier.
Yeah, it is a whole messy soup, dude.
Yeah.
That's my expert opinion after, you know, doing nearly 300 of these conversations over the last half decade. It's a messy, whatever I just said. I already forgot.
I think it was a soup.
Soup. It is a soup.
Which
maybe
it is.
It's a chowder. Maybe I'll do another 300 interviews to clarify that.
Yeah. And is it Manhattan style or New England style? No.
I think it depends on the day. But I think like what is refreshing though is there is sort of like there's been like a gradual decline of this attitude that like video games are incomparable. Like there is starting to be you know, like because it's impossible to deny that like video games are part of like, you know, much bigger things, including economies and society, and you know what I mean. It's like that old stupid line about, you know, oh, they were in the basement and now they're not. But it's like, all right, well, maybe we can actually start to figure out like what these things are. I don't know. Because I was just feeling like, well, I feel like we were just discussing how, like, oh, we keep stumbling over the same problems. And it's like, well, wait, am I being optimistic here? Because I didn't think I was being pessimistic. But it's like, well, maybe this is a good direction that we're heading in. But I feel like, you know, I mean, I don't really want to pry and be like, well, why did you make the decision to, you know, to sort of leave and to chase different things? I mean, I guess you sort of said, but I mean,
no, I'm absolutely happy to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, like, but maybe that is like an indication of like, well, obviously, you know, they're not holding on to certain types of people, you know what I mean? And like that's sort of indicative of something as well.
Yeah, so I mean, why I left was kind of twofold. One was opportunistic because we just had funding for a year, so I like could sort of responsibly say, okay, let's make a go at this. But, you know, my creative aspirations do not sort of neatly fit into what I would get to work on in a AAA context, and also I think especially the kind of level of creative control that I could have in a AAA project. Like the things that I'm interested in exploring are both achievable with a smaller team and like not that likely to get funded. Like I'm not expecting EA to call me up and say, hey, yeah, sure, this weird idea you have, go for it. Um, so, I was just kind of like, I was looking at a future of my career where I stay working like at studios in a kind of 9-to-5 job. And I just kind of know what that looks like. Like I have a pretty good idea of the kinds of games that I'll be working on and the kinds of work and types of problems I'll be solving. And they're just not that interesting to me anymore. I seek novelty in work as well. So by going indie, that kind of allowed me to choose the kinds of games that I want to work on. Like on my company's website, I have like a single member LLC for boring reasons, but it has a website too. And on it, I say that I started this company so that I can make the games I want to see in the world with wonderful people. I want to collaborate with people that I enjoy collaborating with, and I want to make games that are either things that I want to exist in the world or things that are like interesting for me to kind of whittle away on from a design perspective. Like, so the project that I left Hangar 13 to go and start was a detective game that you play where you play as an artificial intelligence that's it takes place on the Internet of Things. And that was like a really interesting perspective for me. Like I don't personally particularly find sort of investigation sleuthing games that interesting. Like to play, I think Oberdin, her story are fascinating from a design perspective, and I think they're like extremely well constructed. But they're not like game experiences that I personally want. But I thought that this sort of like Internet of Things, like weird perspective on the world was going to be an interesting sort of lens to tell a story through that also spoke to some of my lineage as someone who worked on a BioShock game and has a fondness for the immersive sim style like environmental storytelling. And in that way, like it was exciting to me because I felt like there was a chance that we could kind of push that aspect of the medium forward and like break some new ground in ways that I think both her story and Oberdin were successful. So it was this opportunity for me to say like, hey, rather than just like telling another story using the tools that we already know we have, what if we like make a small adaptation to what those tools look like and what kind of like lens you're experiencing them through and what kind of information that would provide to you about a given character, and see if we can't make something interesting out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you may have just answered this, but I mean, you had mentioned in our emails that like you have an interest for video games to simulate things besides violence, and I was going to ask you like, oh, well, what are you imagining? And it sounds like this might be some of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's more that it is some of that, but I think like to just sort of step back and examine that statement a little bit. It's not that I am like not wanting violence to be in a game, although I think the world's got plenty of those, so I do tend to try and like find ways to offer challenges to the player that don't involve combat. But that's kind of exactly it. Is like I'm just tired of like the main kind of thing that's going on in the game being like beat up this pack of guys or shoot this pack of guys and then do it again 100 feet down the road.
Right.
Like one of the games that I have cooking on the back burner is like a first-person shooter, but it's like sort of circumstantial that it is. Like as I was kind of figuring out the design of it, that's just kind of like made sense for a thing to give the player to do. But the things that are actually interesting to me about it is not that it's a shooter, it's that like the weapons are weird and the physics is weird and it's a really goofy world, and like there's dialogue where you're talking to people and you're like sort of sneaking in some places and wearing disguises, and like it's not kind of the constant thing that you're doing, even if it maybe is the primary verb that you have. It's not like your only solution to a problem. That's when I get really frustrated, is just like, okay, the only way through is death.
Well, I think that's ultimately true, I think.
Sure. Through the veil, that is.
Sorry spoiler alert, I'm sorry. But point taken, and I, of course, agree with you. I mean, I feel like we touched on this before, but like something I wanted to mention was something that you mentioned in our emails, which was like you said you feel something that's missing in games is, and this is a long quote, or the font I'm using is big. You said there's this perception that, it's about like just an understanding of how games are made. And you were saying like the vast majority of people have a basic literacy of films at this point and can recognize, for example, that a long single take is impressive. And there's very little of that kind of understanding with game players, and very little transparency on the part of developers. And so I know when asked a question like this, it makes your brain go totally blank, but like, I mean, rather than say like, oh, well, what are all of these things? Like, is there one single thing you could think of in the work that you do or have done? I don't even necessarily say like you wish was better appreciated, although I think that's also true. You just wish it was like understood as being taken for granted. Because when I read this from you, I flashed back to like one of the very first conversations I had for this, where they were talking about this thing, and they were talking about like what a revelation it was when at a game company they figured out how to you shoot somebody. Sounds horrible. You shoot somebody, the blood goes out, and then it stains the wall, and that was like a huge thing. It was like we landed a man on the moon or something. Yeah. So I mean, like, what is stuff like that you feel like people sort of gloss over or might be taking for granted, be it players, critics, other people you work with?
I guess there's my mind goes to two places. First is just like an understanding of what a game looks like through its development, because I mean, it's not quite the same, but like you'll see production photos of a film, which kind of helps you to understand how it came to be. And I think that also kind of plays into that like long single take thing that you mentioned. Game companies are really shy about showing early in development stuff, which for like E3 and stuff makes sense. Whatever, fine. But like, I think players and like prospective game workers would benefit a lot from seeing like what the ugly initial prototype looks like, and then what does it look like 3 months down the line, and having those like laid out on a timeline so you can see how long it takes, and also kind of like what the rate of change is, and also what kind of elements in a game are actually important to the experience that you end up having with it. Like, yeah, I remember at PAX East years ago, Supergiant had brought their initial Bastion prototype and set it up next to the finished game. And it was amazing. Like, it was so great to see, like, okay, what actually makes Bastion is the, like, in terms of a complete experience, is, like, their incredible art from Gen Z and Logan Cunningham's fantastic narration, and Darren Korb's wonderful soundtrack. But the, like, act of playing that game is also just really satisfying. And that was the case in this, like, gray box, like, you're just playing on a green platform, like, nothing has any art on it, the character is a stick figure kind of prototype that they had. And like, the game experience is there, and yeah, they dressed it up in ways that are, like, important and impactful to what that final experience is, but Supergiant and hopefully anyone that played it could play that early version and know, like, okay, there's meat on this bone, and we know the skills we have in our studio, and we know that we can, like, dress it up in a way that's going to be really satisfying. But even now, it's already a good experience.
So, I mean, is this a thing you think, like, I mean, again, this is a thing, because I think it's also, like, part of bigger patterns of ways we as individuals are sort of disconnected, sometimes intentionally, you know, from the production chains and the pipelines behind the things we consume. And so, you know, it's part of, like, you know, literally things we consume, like our food, but it's also, like, cultural output. Like, is this a thing, though, that, like, you feel like, can game developers combat that sort of thing? Can critics combat that sort of thing? Or is this another kind of, boy, this is a thing and we have to sort of shrug at it thing?
I mean,
because I don't know if game companies care, and I don't know. I know they have many arguments, or they used to, like, for why, you know, readers wouldn't care, don't need to care. But I don't understand the mentality of, like, well, if you're a fan of a thing, isn't it normal to want to, like, do a deep dive and to, like, learn as much as you can? There's just, like, these weird limits on that stuff in games.
Yeah. Like, they, you know, companies will produce these, like, 15-minute narrated videos of, like, we're going to go into the system, but they're not going to tell you how they got there. And I think that's way more interesting. And I think players would find that pretty interesting, too.
It's funny because my old example for this used to be Nintendo, and when they put out, you know, the 25th, I guess, 10 years ago, I guess, like, the 25th anniversary Mario stuff, and it was, and, you know, now there's another instance of this now, 10 years later, which is perhaps even more perplexingly limited and strange, because I remember, I was like, oh, cool, they're going to put out an anniversary version of, like, this huge flagship game, and, you know, I'm going to learn a ton about this thing that, like, for a long time, actually no one had a record of when it even was released.
Right.
And it was a thing where it was like, here are the games, and it comes with the CD that's, like, maybe it had, like, you know, 1 second tracks of, like, the sound of the coin, and there was a very, like, I guess, like, small glossy part of the book which really didn't tell you much. And now 10 years later we have whatever it is that's going on with, like, the, you know, the 3D version of it, where to celebrate the legacy of, like, one of the biggest video game series in the world, it's gonna disappear in 6 months.
Yeah. What a celebration.
Yeah, happy birthday, Mario. We're gonna delete your source code in half a year. So, I mean, it's like, it's a thing that obviously is not changing in a certain regard, but you know, I think it's kind of upsetting because it really is it. I don't know if you have insight into it, but, like, I find it really fascinating because it's like, well, is it just trying to, like, protect this myth that, like, games just sort of come out fully formed magically, you know, from the godlike creator, or, like, yeah.
I suspect that's part of it, but I think there's also probably an element of, like, games are born out of the software industry rather than other, like, creative industries.
Yeah.
So there's this, like, rich history of trade secrets and protecting your source code and all that kind of thing.
Well, and to your point, I was like, boy, I don't even know if I could tell you who made WinZip, and I used WinZip a ton.
Right.
You don't have to laugh at that. It's just like, yeah, that is true.
No, I mean, I used WinZip too, although I probably use WinRAR more on balance.
I do too, but I was just, just thinking going back, I was like, yeah, I don't even know who makes the compression software, like a thing that I use all the time. That's, yeah. Did Miyamoto make WinZip, you think?
That seems like a reasonable bet.
I mean, I don't know that
There's
he
no
didn't.
evidence to the contrary, right?
Exactly. So therefore, ergo, using the transitive property, it must be right.
Exactly. So I think that's part of, like, you know, the magical mystery of how games get made is part of, like, it, but there's the sort of business side of that same element. But you know, I do see especially indie creators being more and more open with their process. Like, with the advent of Twitch, there are people that are streaming their development. You can just kind of pop in and see the state of X game on any given day. I think the thing that is kind of missing right now, except maybe for the Double Fine documentary that they did for Amnesia, well, both Amnesia Fortnite and for Broken Age. I think both of those documentary series are excellent and should be required viewing for anyone that wants to work in video games and arguably also play video games and, like, be sort of engaged in this hobby in a more serious and critical way. Because those are retrospectives. Like, I think, though, it's useful to kind of expose, like, hey, here's what Tuesday of game development looks like. It's kind of more like the first step is not it's not that. Like, the more useful step is having these sort of, like, retrospectives, like, here's what it was like to do this, and here's what that process actually was, and you can kind of, like, have that, a little bit of commentary on it with a little bit of distance that I think is really valuable, because you don't always even necessarily know in the moment, like, why you're making a decision or why a thing, like, needs to change. It's just like, this isn't really working, so we'll throw some shit at the wall.
Yeah. Well, hey, I have one last question here for you.
Sure.
Unless, I know we hopped around a ton, which is to say we had a conversation between two humans. Like, was there something you wanted to bring up that we didn't get a chance to touch on?
I'm just looking back at my notes from our email exchange.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Well, I also want to be respectful of your time because I think we went beyond. I'm
doing absolutely nothing, both because the general state of the world and because a roommate of mine got a positive test recently, so we've been fully quarantined.
Oh, gosh.
So I'm not going anywhere. Yeah, that's been exciting.
I'm sorry to hear that. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. It's a thing.
All right. Well, this will be a extra absurd segue into this last question. What do you feel video games have accomplished?
I mean, like, the straightforward answer, I think, is, or at least for me, is offered, like, a new type of entertainment that I think is, like, expressive in some novel ways. And, you know, I'm not necessarily one of these people that adheres to, like, oh my god, games are the most incredible, like, medium, and the fact that they're interactive is, like, fundamental, and there's experiences that can only be a game. But I do think that games, and I should mention, I have, like, an extremely permissive definition of games. Basically, if there are rules, to me it is a game, because games are systems. Like, yeah. So, sorry, lost my track of thought. So the things that I think games do especially well are creating meaning through interaction. Like, it's not that you can't tell a story about losing your brother in another medium, but the game Brothers has, like, a really specific thing that it achieves because of the way in which you experience that game by literally using your two thumbs to control two different characters. And then at some point, spoilers, one of those characters goes away, and you've like developed all this muscle memory, and that like just layers this really interesting aspect into what that emotional experience you had is. Like Edith Finch is another example that I go to when I think about this kind of thing. Like, I don't know if you've played that one, but there's this segment where you're playing a character who works in a fish factory, and it has you do this like really rote, sort of like repetitive action on the gamepad, and it kind of overlays it with some other thing in the moment that makes that sort of repetitiveness really like allow you to connect, I think, especially well with the message that they're delivering in that moment. So I get excited about that stuff. I also get excited about the fact that games are just systems, like they're a set of rules and therefore exist to be explored. Like I think that's a thing that our brains really like to do, and is a lot of the enjoyment I tend to get out of games is that sort of expressive nature of them. So yeah, I guess those are kind of the two things, is that like there's this extra little element to how you experience the emotional weight of a game, and also the way that they provide. I mean, it's play. Like play is this wonderful, amazing human thing that has an enormously long and rich history, and video games are just a new arena for that.